class. This will be my lesson on pathos. Today it's pronounced pathos, but I've always said pathos, so I'll probably go back and forth. Bear with me. But welcome everyone. This will be our, I think, third video lesson. Like I said, I will be changing it up, but I think with these early lessons, I like to kind of just show my face, talk a little bit about it, mimic, like I said before, what I would talk about in class, okay? But if you have your book, go ahead and pull that out now. Like I said, I'll be looking here, looking at my computer. I got various notes that I want to touch on. I may be trying different formats as we move along here, showing you what I'm looking at on the computer, etc. But for now, I'm going to stick to this, and you can always let me know if it's hard to follow along, you can't hear me, etc. All good, okay? But anyways, what I want to look at is this idea of pathos, okay? I'm in the Lunsford, just a reminder, we're using this book, okay? If you have the old edition, it's different. So I would advise getting this edition because we really need to get going with this because our first essay is coming up very soon. You'll have a prompt, we'll have a prompt, essay 1 prompt soon, and then we'll have a dissection of all that in just a second here, okay? And we can review certain things on the schedule as well. So we'll do that, you know, as we go along here. But for the most part, let's get into this pathos lesson, okay? I want to take a look at these early images on page 32 and 33 from the Lunsford reading. Okay, so and we're going to think about what pathos are, and those are basically emotional appeals, right? So if we're following along here, I see, and I guess I can do this. We got some 4 images, correct? We have one of a poor soul looking at a boat with cracked earth. We have a polar bear on an iceberg. I hate to laugh, it's kind of sad. We have the world dripping, it's melting, right? And then we also have this last one, right? Global warming, hoax exposed. Okay, so we can think about these images and we understand that those images are emotionally appealing to us in some way, okay? And what we see there is we obviously know it's climate change debate, and what are they trying to do there, right? Insinuating this little kid will not have, that looks like an old fishing boat, right? So immediately, and even if you don't care about that, we can understand what they're doing to us there, right? So like I said, we're going to talk about, especially in this section here with pathos, logos, and ethos. As you saw in the video that we watched, the Camille Langston, how these 3 are used against us also really matters. Okay, so with this pathos, I want us to think about these 3 images here, right? And what they invoke, right? Not to say that we're not going to critically understand, okay, what are they trying to evoke in me? That's important. But also we're going to say, okay, what are the methods they're using here? Okay, and we'll go along with that. And I like how they started this here, right? To give us a sense as a prime debate is climate change. What then do these do to us if they want you to change the kind of climate change? And then they have the last one, which shows that it's a hoax, right? So I like what they did there. It's not just one way. Okay. I want to think about what the early lesson says here. Like I said, we're not going to go through everything because I want you to have read this. But our first essay is definitively based on these 3, pathos, ethos, logos. And it's based on how we are presented the information about our painting, Las Meninas, right? So I want us to think about how each theorist or each thinker, when discussing Las Meninas, you can even think of the Diego Velázquez when he painted Las Meninas. And we'll talk, we're going to write about that in the essay. Which were they using? Okay, this one is an emotional appeal, right? So I want to think about this when we talk about pathos, like fear. Lunsford says here, how fear is less effective than those that arouse interest, right? So an emotional appeal, and don't get me wrong, think about our current president, where your political leanings lie. But even the Democratic presidents, even I think of, Bernie Sanders, I'm just trying to make it current. He is trying to invoke this fear of this kind of, power taken away from the workers, for example, right? So fear is, it says here, is less effective than those that arouse interest, arguments that arouse interest. I agree with that, but I also can see how fear has been, widely an effective method to turn people. Okay, a lot of people argue that Trump did use fear, right? The fear of the border wall, the fear of this type of kind of invasion of the migrant population, the fear of, socialism, whatever you want to say, right? So you can argue that as well, okay? But I think it's a really important thing that, a really important aspect that Lunsford talks about on page 33, is how emotional appeals should not be used casually or rashly. Okay, so what I mean by that is like these emotional appeals are not used just kind of flippantly, right? Because I think in what we're going to examine here, when they're used in that way, they are easily dismissed or not considered. Sorry about that. Not considered valid. Okay, and that's important because we're going to think about not only how pathos or arguments are used against us. How then maybe will you use pathos as a critical thinker and a sharer of information? Okay, but let's think about this. Let's go ahead here, right? So reading critically, let's go to page 34. Like I said, we're thinking about the idea of this Cuba debate. Okay, really interesting. Like I said, I like how this book jumps back and forth. So there's no, I was like, oh, when I read this first, I was like, oh, it's kind of right leaning. And I was like, oh, it's kind of left leaning. But I like that because they're trying to be unbiased. They even kind of talk about Fox News, I think, and I don't know if it's this chapter or the next, but and it's really interesting how they use these debates. So I really like this because despite your political leanings, you can see what they say about Marco Rubio here. And whether you agree with Rubio here or not, we understand that Rubio is using an emotional appeal of why when Obama was president, why America should not be aligned with Cuba, right? I'm not going to get into that, right? But we understand he is using an emotional appeal with what? Let's look at page 35 here, right? I'll read a little bit, but then we'll move on here. Let me tell you what the Cubans are really good at because they don't know how to run their economy, they don't know how to build, they don't know how to govern a people. What they are really good at is repression, okay? And this was around the time, and you don't really need to know too much history about the time, but this was around the time that Obama was trying to lift the sanctions, and not only the sanctions, but this restrictions of visiting Cuba and having really a relationship with them. It's been a long time since the Cold War, right? Rubio was against this, right? And he's still to this, if you look at the picture on the bottom of 35, he is still against this, right? He is making a case here, and what I want you to really study is how Rubio makes the case using pathos, emotional appeals, right? He is saying here what they're good at is shutting off information to the internet and to radio and television and social media. That's what they're really good at. And they're not just good at it domestically, they're good exporters of these things. Really a repression of freedom, okay, which is important, right? So I want you to think about that. I want you to think about how Rubio does that here. And like I said, no matter your political leanings, whether you like Rubio or not, you can see how he uses an emotional appeal to make his case regarding Cuba, okay? Let's move ahead here. Using emotions to build bridges on page 36. Okay, so we want to think about, I thought this was interesting how Steve Jobs started Pixar. I was like, really? That's interesting, right? But let's look at this Steve Jobs and obviously that's not the most important part. But Steve Jobs, it's interesting, right? Steve Jobs doesn't have much admired in his commencement address, right? He tells the audience that he doesn't have a fancy speech, just 3 stories from his life, right? And you may think like, oh, Steve Jobs, what do we have in common? But when I've read these stories, that kind of reminds me of, not that I started Apple or Pixar, I'd be on my yacht right now, but the fact that Steve Jobs humanizes himself, right, for an audience that will be graduating and kind of starting off in their future at a commencement speech. We also see J.K. Rowling's speech using here as well, right? So in this understanding of Jobs' commencement, we understand that it is not a recollection of a formal argument. He's just telling you a personal life story, right, of how he got fired from Apple. And he then moved him to become a big time innovator in his field. And then also, like I said, not only did he have a stake in Apple after he got fired and he came back and did whatever he had to do to find himself, he was so inspired that he also turned that into a career with Pixar, which is the biggest animators. If you've seen Toy Story, I think Toy Story was in my last lesson. That shows you, right? So he's giving this argument, and it would be much different if he was saying, hey, and this is what I did with Apple and I founded this. Kind of boring and like, okay, cool, your historical bio or Wikipedia entry. He did more so than that. He kind of found relatable emotional appeals that if you've been fired from a job, maybe if you're finding your way, you don't know where you want to go in life, he touched on these and cultivated these to connect to his audience, something that emotional appeals are bent on, okay? Kind of a cool picture on the bottom of 38, The Birth of a Vegetarian, a visual version of Michael Pollan's rhetorical situation. You can read that on your own. Don't have time to go over that. Like I said, my aim is always about 10 minutes, but I go too long. We're already at the 10-minute mark. But let's think about this here. Using pathos, arguments based on emotions, using emotions to sustain an argument, page 39. Okay. Emotions are precarious, though, as we study here, right? Too much becomes fake, and this is something you can think about in an emotional appeal. If it's not, if it's transparent, I like to use that term. Politicians are sometimes very transparent. Like I said, I'll leave that to you to decide, and maybe that's something you want to write about in our journal entry. But sometimes we have these ideas of politicians being too fake, or pandering is a good way to think about that. Also, if they are not emotional enough, and this happens a lot with women politicians. I feel this a lot. So you can think about it in this way. They are seen as too cold or stoic, okay? And that's a really important distinction, okay? So this is something that you can always think about, right? And the Lunsford agrees here. Using emotion is tricky. I'm in the middle of 39. And it can sometimes backfire, okay? Lay on too much feeling, especially sentiments like outrage, pity, or shame, which make people uncomfortable. You may offend the very audience you hope to convince, okay? Now I want you to think about that when you use pathos as your own arguments, okay? Emotional appeals. Also want you to think about that when emotional appeals are a little bit too much, laid on thick. And that already probably naturally happens, okay? Let's take a look at this passage here. And I don't know if I can go through the whole thing depending on time, but when you close read Richard Lloyd Perry's Ghost of Tsunami, Death and Life in Japan's Disaster Zone, okay? In this passage, Perry describes vivid detail the scene that greeted one mother the day the 2011 earthquake hit, okay? I'm not going to read the whole thing. Be really helpful to when you envision or when you study Perry's excerpt here, close read and annotate it and understand and ask yourself this question. How does Perry, first question, I'm sorry. How does Perry utilize pathos, emotional appeal? How effective is it also? Those are important questions. How effective is Perry in establishing pathos and tapping into something that can make this relatable? Okay, very important question. I also want you to think about what's going on in the Bahamas right now. Pretty bad, Hurricane Dorian. It's just so destructive, right? And we see these images on the news, and sometimes they kind of get glossed over, but the fact that if we read the accounting, if we see the pictures of the faces, know the people, right? Those are emotional appeals, right? That can embolden or kind of strengthen maybe a response, hopefully. Not always. Okay, think of Katrina back in the day, okay? On a lighter note, let's go to the bottom of page 40, using humor. I'm going to go ahead and add a video to this lesson. So there's going to be 3 modules: pathos, ethos, logos, in that order, just as they are presented in the book. But on the bottom of the pathos one, you're going to see it down below. I'm going to add this actual James Oliver video. And also I might add a couple more just because I want you to kind of see how he uses an emotional appeal, because sometimes people think pathos is simply emotion in the sense like, oh, boo-hoo, or, disaster, destruction, sadness. It's also humor, okay? Very important to see how humor is used. How humor, and I wrote here, how humor forces some to suspend their judgment. And I really think, and it doesn't mention, Lunsford does not talk about this, but when the humor is used effectively as an emotional appeal, it is a way to disarm, okay? D-I-S-A-R-M, disarm. Spelled it because it's so important. It feels as almost when somebody uses humor effectively as an emotional appeal, you become disarmed, okay? And I want you to think about that as it's used against you, and maybe, who knows? You don't have to be humorous to make an appeal, but it doesn't hurt, right? Okay, so Oliver, like I said, one of my faves. Love this dude. He's funny. Okay. And like I said, I'm going to add his video on standardized testing. Okay, keeps audience engaged, also has multitude of effects. Keeps the audience engaged, keeps them interested, also disarms them to maybe think about a topic that they have not thought about in a certain way. Okay, but it is tricky. Think about a comic that bombs, just like when we talked about emotional appeals can be tricky in the sense that if it's too fake. Same thing with humor. If it doesn't hit, you may lose your audience. Okay, and I've seen, I wrote here, think cringe. Cringe is cool maybe in The Office, but the show The Office, but cringe doesn't always work. If somebody's just saying something that doesn't affect you, best believe you will not then it kind of hold on to that argument and say, oh, I want to hear what you want to say. Okay, that's really, people kind of dismiss that power in that. We're going to wrap up here. Pathos, using arguments based on emotion. So on page 43, okay, I want you to, the reason I want you to sit with this is I want you to think of this when you're writing, right? We're not just studying pathos, ethos, and logos for the mere fact of understanding how it is used against you. It's important because that's what Camille Langston uses. It also is in becoming a critical thinker. How then will you use these, right? And I may ask you, not specifically to use these, but you can understand in any discipline, right? Critical thinking is not for just for English. This is an English course, so we do a lot of reading and literature, etc. But moving forward, I want you to examine those, right? You may be in a job where you have to use pathos and emotional appeal to state your case. Could be simple fact you need more days off to study for school, right? Could be maybe you'd like to change the organization you're with. Maybe you work for a nonprofit and the money doesn't go where it should be. Okay, maybe you're a nurse and you need an emotional appeal to how maybe have more supplies. I don't know, right? So I want you to think in that way. Think in this way. Critical thinking is valuable in multitude of avenues. Okay. So I think that's pretty it, right? I mean, last thing I want to say maybe here is the power of stories. Okay, we see stories here, like I said, that Bahamas example. The fact that you see the pictures, we see a lot of disaster pictures that's kind of spectacleized. So I'm sorry, this is spectacles, not as impactful. Stories then become these emotional appeals if we know the names and those peoples and the faces. Okay. So yeah, that's it. Go ahead and wrap up. Check out those Oliver videos, and when you're done with that, next page to ethos. See you soon.